Elara was a widow. That was the first and last thing most people in Prospect's Peak knew about her. She lived on the far edge of the valley, where the pines grew thick and the mountain's shadow fell first. Her cabin was small, built by her late husband, Elias. It was built of sturdy logs, chinked with mud and moss, a simple box against the wilderness. Her only companion was a horse, a stout beast of burden named Jasper. She owned an axe, a rifle, and a set of leather-bound journals. The journals were her most prized possession. They were Elias's legacy. He had not been a man of many words, but he had been a man of deep observation. For 30 years, he had recorded the life of the mountain. He noted the dates the geese flew south. He marked the day the first ice formed on the creek. He sketched the patterns of squirrel nests, the depth of the rabbit burrows, the thickness of the beaver dams. He wrote of winters past, of the great freeze of 28 and the white death of 41. He had developed a science of his own, one written not in textbooks, but in the bark of trees and the behavior of animals. Elara had read the journals until the ink faded and the pages softened under her touch. In the summer of 57, she read them with a growing sense of unease. The signs were there. The squirrels were frantic, their winter caches already overflowing by August. The bears were fattening with a desperate speed, their coats unusually thick. The pine cones at the tops of the tallest trees were clustered in a way Elias had described only once, in the entry dated before the worst winter on his record. A winter that had lasted 5 months. A winter that had claimed a dozen lives in Prospect's Peak. Elara made a decision. She would not just prepare, she would build. Elias had designed it in the last pages of his final journal, a theoretical structure, a place of absolute sanctuary against the cold. He called it the Winter Hold. It was to be an expansion of the cabin, but built down, not out, dug into the granite slope that rose up directly behind their home. A larder, a stable, and a living space, all connected and insulated by the earth itself. Geothermal mass, Elias had written, the mountain's own warmth. The project required excavation. It required a permit. So Elara walked the 3 miles into town. The town of Prospect's Peak was proud. It was a town that believed in progress, in modernity. It had a new general store, a new church spire, and a new mayor. Mayor Thompson was a man who believed in ledgers and laws, not in squirrel nests and pine cones. He sat behind a large oak desk, his face a mask of civic importance. Elara stood before him, a quiet figure in homespun wool. She explained her plan directly, without embellishment. She spoke of the signs. She spoke of the coming winter. The mayor listened with a patient, condescending smile. "My dear woman," he began, steepling his fingers, "we have a weather service now. We have barometers and telegraphs. We rely on science, not folklore." "This is a different kind of science," Elara said, her voice even. "It's the science of survival." The mayor sighed. "You want a permit to dig a root cellar. A very large root cellar." "I want a permit to build a shelter," she corrected. He stamped the paper with a flourish. "Here you are. Dig your hole, Mistress Elara, but do not come into town spreading these fanciful, frightening stories. We are a forward-thinking community." Elara took the permit and left without another word. The story, however, did not stay in the mayor's office. It became a piece of town entertainment, the tale of the queer widow and her great big hole in the ground. Mr. Sterling was the town's wealthiest man, a rancher who had just completed a magnificent new hunting lodge on the opposite side of the valley. It was a monument to modern comfort, with vast picture windows, a stone fireplace tall enough to stand in, and a brand new furnace that ran on heating oil, delivered by truck. He heard the story at the general store and laughed, a loud, booming sound that made the canned goods rattle. "A hole in the ground," he bellowed, "while I am building a palace of warmth and glass. She intends to live like a badger, while we live like kings." His laughter was infectious. Soon, others joined in. Dr. Finch was the town's physician. A man of education and instruments, he saw the world through a lens of verifiable data. He dismissed Elara's observations as anecdotal nonsense. "The woman is suffering from grief-induced paranoia," he declared over a game of checkers. "Animal behavior is dictated by instinct and immediate stimuli, not some mystical ability to predict the weather months in advance. It's unscientific." The mockery solidified into a name. Elara's Folly. The name stuck. The children would whisper it as she passed. The women at the sewing circle would titter about it. The men at the saloon would toast to it. A new phrase entered the town's lexicon. To do something pointless and foolish was to dig a folly. Elara heard the whispers. She saw the smirks. She paid them no mind. She had work to do. The 1st of September, she began. The work was brutal. The ground behind the cabin was rocky, unforgiving. She and Jasper worked from sunup to sundown. Jasper, fitted with a special harness, would pull a heavy stone boat, dragging away the earth and rock she loosened with a pickaxe and shovel. The rhythm of her life became the scrape of steel on stone, the creak of leather, the soft snort of the horse. Day after day, the pile of excavated earth grew, the hole deepened. The townspeople would sometimes ride out on a Sunday just to look, to marvel at the scale of her wasted effort. She ignored them. She was not digging a massive pit behind her tiny cabin. They shook their heads and rode away, more certain than ever of her madness. She ignored them. She was not digging a pit. She was following a plan. Elias's journal was propped on a stump, its pages held open with a smooth river stone. Every measurement was precise. The main chamber was to be 20 feet wide and 30 feet long, with a ceiling 12 feet high at its apex. She used dynamite sparingly, drilling into the granite face with a star drill and a sledgehammer, a slow and punishing process. The explosions were small, muffled charges, just enough to crack the rock she could not move by hand. Once the space was cleared, the real work began. She became a mason. She and Jasper hauled fieldstones from the creek bed, one stone boat at a time. She mixed her own mortar from clay, sand, and wood ash. Slowly, meticulously, she built retaining walls, reinforcing the earthen sides of the excavation. She built a vaulted ceiling of interlocking stones, a design from one of Elias's books on ancient Roman engineering. It was a work of immense strength and careful calculation. Then came the ventilation. This was the most critical part. A simple hole in the ground would become a cold, damp tomb. Elias's design was ingenious. 2 flues built into the stonework. One was a cold air intake, a long pipe that ran 60 feet underground before surfacing far up the slope. By the time the winter air reached the shelter, the earth would have warmed it from lethal cold to merely brisk. The second was a chimney for the small iron stove she would install, carefully routed through the rock and designed with a baffle system to prevent heat from escaping too quickly. It was a closed system, a breathing shelter. While the construction continued, she also prepared for the siege. Her garden had been larger than ever that year. Every evening, after the heavy labor was done, she worked by lantern light. She canned vegetables, she pickled beets and cucumbers, She sliced apples and squash into thin discs and dried them on racks near the hearth until they were crisp and light. She salted fish caught from the river and cured venison from a deer she had taken early in the season. The shelves of the completed larder began to fill, row upon row of glass jars, slabs of salted meat hanging from iron hooks, sacks of flour, beans and oats sealed in tin-lined wooden chests to keep out the mice. She harvested wood, not just for the coming winter, but for the one after. She and Jasper dragged fallen logs from the deep woods. She spent weeks splitting and stacking, creating a woodpile that was a fortress unto itself. Most of it was stacked outside, but a significant portion, the driest birch and oak, was moved into a dedicated space within the winter hold. The stable for Jasper was the last part to be finished. It was a snug, stone-lined room connected to the main chamber, with its own ventilation and a thick bed of dried straw. She laid in a dozen bales of hay and sacks of oats, enough to keep him comfortable and well fed for months. By the end of October, it was done. The back wall of her original cabin now had a new, heavy door made of reinforced oak. It opened not to the outside, but to a stone staircase leading down into the quiet, cool, earthen-smelling dark of the winter hold. The project had taken her 3 solid months of back-breaking labor. She was thinner, her hands calloused and scarred, but her eyes held a calm, steady light. Elara's Folly was complete. November arrived. The air grew sharp. The townspeople of Prospect's Peak settled in for a typical winter. Mr. Sterling hosted a grand party at his new lodge, showing off the roaring fire and the powerful furnace that kept the great windows free of frost. Dr. Finch published an article in the regional paper, debunking old wives' tales about weather prediction. Mayor Thompson reviewed the town's budget, satisfied they had ample supplies for a normal season. They had all forgotten about the widow and her hole in the ground. But Elara was watching. The signs were now escalating, moving from prediction to imminent reality. The deep woods fell silent. The usual chatter of birds and squirrels was gone. A flock of snow geese, birds that should have been 1,000 miles south, landed in the valley, confused and exhausted, before disappearing overnight. A herd of elk, driven by an unseen terror, stampeded through the lowlands, a river of brown fur and panicked eyes, heading for the shelter of the deepest canyons. Elias had written of this. The Great Silence, he called it. The final warning. On the morning of November 14th, the air changed. It became heavy, still, and carried a strange, metallic scent. The sky was not cloudy, but was veiled in a high, thin haze that stole the warmth from the sun, leaving only a cold, white light. Elara checked the old barometer Elias had mounted by the door. The needle had dropped. Not just dropped, but plunged. It rested against the pin at the very bottom of the dial, a reading so low it should have been impossible. She looked out at the valley, at the thin plumes of smoke rising from the chimneys in town. A part of her, a small, human part, wanted to ride Jasper into the center of town and scream a warning. But she remembered the mayor's condescending smile. She remembered Mr. Sterling's booming laugh. She remembered the doctor's smug dismissal. They would not listen. They would call her mad. They would say she was just trying to justify her folly. Her duty was not to those who would not hear. Her duty was to the wisdom Elias had left her. Her duty was to survive. She conducted her final preparations with calm, methodical grace. Last of her dried herbs and other perishables down the stone stairs. Finally, she stood at the entrance of the winter hold and looked back at her small, familiar cabin. Then she pulled the heavy oak door shut. The thick bolts, oiled and ready, slid home with a satisfying thud. She was sealed inside. Outside, the world held its breath. The storm arrived at 4:17 p.m. on November 15th. It did not begin with a gentle snowfall. It arrived like a physical blow. A wall of white and wind struck the valley with the force of a tidal wave. The wind did not howl, it shrieked, a solid, high-pitched scream of immense pressure. The snow was not flakes, but a blinding, horizontal torrent of ice crystals, hard and sharp as sand. It was a thing of mythic violence. For less than an hour, before it twisted, for less than an hour, before it twisted and fell, crashing through the roof of the general store. The power lines, strung between poles that swayed like saplings, snapped in a shower of blue sparks, plunging the town into darkness. At his magnificent lodge, Mr. Sterling watched in horror as one of his vast picture windows bowed inward and then exploded, the sound lost in the roar of the wind. The storm poured into his home. His powerful furnace, starved of oxygen and choked with snow, sputtered and died. The temperature inside dropped 20 degrees in 10 minutes. Dr. Finch tapped his barometer, convinced it was broken. It had given no warning of a storm of this magnitude. His scientific instruments were useless against the reality of the onslaught. The town's conventional systems failed. They failed completely and immediately. The water pipes froze within hours. The roads vanished, not just covered, but erased under a moving landscape of white. Houses became traps. Chimneys, clogged with driven snow, filled rooms with choking smoke, forcing people to extinguish their only source of heat. The snow fell and fell. It fell for a day. It fell for 3. It fell for a week. The town of Prospect's Peak was being buried alive. Roofs began to collapse under the immense, unbelievable weight. The first to go was the roof of the new stable at Mr. Sterling's ranch, crushing his prize-winning cattle. Then went the flatter roofs in town, groaning and splintering, dumping tons of snow onto the families huddled below. Inside the winter hold, Elara knew none of this. The roar of the storm was a distant, muffled hum, the sound of a faraway ocean. The tons of snow piling up over her shelter were not a threat. They were insulation. The temperature in the main chamber held steady at 55 degrees, warmed by the earth, the presence of the horse, and her own body heat. She lit her small iron stove only for a few hours each day to cook, using just a handful of logs. The air from the intake flue was cool but fresh. The stone walls were dry. Her life continued in a serene, insulated rhythm. She mended clothes. She read Elias's journals again. She tended to Jasper, who stood calm and patient in his stall. She ate simple, nourishing meals from her stores. She slept soundly, wrapped in wool blankets, safe from the white death that was consuming the world above. After 10 days, the shrieking of the wind subsided. The silence that followed was absolute. The storm had passed, but the siege had just begun. Outside, the landscape was unrecognizable. The snow was 20 feet deep in the valley, drifted to 40 or 50 feet against the buildings. The sun shone on a smooth, white, silent world. There were no roads, no fences, no cabins. Only strange white mounds where a town used to be. Here and there, a chimney pot or a roof peak poked through, pathetic markers of a buried world. Survival became a desperate, minute-by-minute struggle. Families were trapped in freezing, dark houses, their food and firewood running out. Frostbite was rampant. Then starvation began to set in. Hope began to die. It was Dr. Finch who found her. He and his family had survived, their older, sturdier house holding against the snow, but they were out of food, and his youngest son was sick with a fever. Desperate, he had fashioned crude snowshoes and set out, not knowing where he was going, only that he had to do something. He stumbled through the alien landscape for hours, exhausted and half frozen. He almost missed it. A thin, almost invisible wisp of smoke, rising from what looked like a simple vent pipe sticking out of a massive snowdrift. He clawed his way toward it, his mind reeling. The drift was the slope behind Elara's cabin. The pipe was the chimney of her folly. He dug at the snow with frozen, clumsy hands, uncovering the top of a heavy stone lintel and the upper edge of a door. He hammered on it, his voice a raw croak.
"Hello? Is anyone there? Help us!"
Inside, Elara heard the faint, muffled thumping. She took a lantern and a shovel, unbolted the heavy door, and pushed. It opened into a wall of solid snow. She began to dig. She dug a narrow tunnel upward, following the sound of the desperate shouts. When her shovel finally broke through into the blinding sunlight, she saw a man's face, caked in ice, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. It was Dr. Finch. He stared at her healthy complexion, at the calm in her eyes, at the steady light of the lantern behind her. He saw not a madwoman, but a prophet. His arrogance shattered. "Help us," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. "My boy is sick." Elara looked at the man who had dismissed her as unscientific. She saw only another human being, cold and afraid. "Bring them," she said, her voice even and calm. She did not say, "I told you so." She did not need to. The world had said it for her. The arrival of Dr. Finch and his family was the beginning. He became her messenger, guiding other survivors to the impossible sanctuary in the snow. A procession of the humbled began. One by one, family by family, the people of Prospect's Peak made their way to Elara's Folly. They emerged from their frozen tombs, their faces gaunt, their bodies wrapped in rags, and stumbled through the snow toward the wisp of smoke. They came to the door of the woman they had mocked, and she took them in. She welcomed them into the warm, candlelit space. She gave them hot soup and bread. She tended to their frostbite with herbal salves. The winter hold, built for one, became a shelter for 40. Elara, the outcast, became their leader. She organized them with quiet authority. She rationed the food, ensuring everyone had enough. She established routines, giving purpose to the desperate survivors. The last to arrive were the most broken. Mayor Thompson appeared, half carrying his wife, his face a grey mask of shame. His civic authority was meaningless here. He was just a cold man in need of shelter. And then came Mr. Sterling. His grand lodge was a ruin. His wealth was useless. He had lost everything except the clothes on his back. He stood at the entrance of the winter hold, the badger hole he had ridiculed, and he wept. He wept for his pride, for his foolishness, for the simple, profound wisdom he had laughed at. For weeks they lived together under the snow. The community of Prospect's Peak was reborn in the belly of the mountain, sustained by the foresight of the woman they had called a fool. When the thaw finally came, late in the spring, it was a slow and messy affair. The world re-emerged, sodden and broken. The town was a wreck. But the people had survived. One of the first things they did was hold a town meeting. It was held in the open air amidst the debris of their former lives. Elara stood to one side, quiet and apart, as she had always been. Mayor Thompson, Mr. Sterling, and Dr. Finch walked to the center of the gathering. They stood before their friends and neighbours. They stood before Elara. It was Mayor Thompson who spoke first, his voice stripped of all its former pomposity. "We were proud," he said, his voice cracking. "We believed in our new world, in our progress. We believed we were smarter than the mountain." He paused and looked directly at Elara. "She tried to warn us, and we called her a fool." Mr. Sterling stepped forward next. The booming laugh was gone, replaced by a raw humility. "I built a palace of glass, and it shattered," he said. "She built a shelter of stone and earth, and it held. My wealth could not keep out a single snowflake. Her wisdom saved us all." Finally, Dr. Finch spoke, his words measured and clear. "I am a man of science. I believed only what I could measure. But I was wrong. There is a deeper science, a knowledge that comes from listening, not just looking. Elara listened to the world, and we refused to hear her." He turned to face her fully, and in front of the entire town, he bowed his head. "You were right," he said, "and we were wrong. We are sorry." The words hung in the clean mountain air. You were right. We were wrong. It was a complete and total vindication. Elara stepped forward. She did not offer forgiveness, for there was nothing to forgive. Pride was its own punishment. She spoke of the future. "The mountain gives us signs," she said, her voice carrying across the silent crowd. "Survival is not about being strong. It is about being prepared. It is about listening to the truth, no matter how quiet its voice." The town of Prospect's Peak rebuilt, but they rebuilt differently. They built smaller, sturdier homes, dug into the hillsides. They built deep larders and filled them every autumn. They learned to read the signs, to watch the squirrels, to respect the old ways. The principles of Elara's Folly became the foundation of their new community. And the phrase, "digging a folly," was reborn. It came to mean an act of uncommon foresight, an act of profound and life-saving wisdom. Elara never moved back into the center of the town's social life. She remained in her cabin on the edge of the valley. She did not seek power or praise, but she was never an outcast again. She became a teacher. People came to her not for idle gossip, but for knowledge. She taught them which herbs healed. She taught them how to preserve food for a long winter. She taught them to read the language of the mountain, with the sound of the melting creek, just outside her window. The townspeople buried her on the hill overlooking the valley, and on the heavy oak door of the winter hold, they placed a simple bronze plaque. It did not bear her name. It bore the words that had become their creed. "The mountain gives us signs. Listen."